Wild Branch is a truly pure cannabis oil. They make CBD containing zero THC and no carrier oils. Use Wild Branch oils and salves to calm, cool, and soothe your body and leaving you pain free. I know I've used it anytime that my feet burn because I have neuropathy real bad. When I use this is a product I believe in. When you go to order, use promo code GWI22 for 22% off. GWI22 for 22% off is the promo code. Click the link below. Thank you. Now back to the show. Welcome to Go For Side Effects. I'm your host, Kevin Simon. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Garth Nicolson. How are you doing today, doctor?
I'm doing fine.
Good. And y'all know Sarah. Say hi, Sarah.
Hey, how's everyone doing?
And we got John.
Hey.
And we got Wade.
Hello.
I know we're running a little bit late this evening, but that's absolutely fine. To let everybody know that I know we haven't been live for a while, but our lives are coming back. We had some health issues with COVID and everything going on, which we will discuss next week and everything. But today, Wade, I want you to introduce Dr. Nicolson.
Dr. Garth Nicolson from the Institute of Molecular Medicine. And correct me if I'm wrong, doctor. He was essentially a pioneer researcher for Go4 illness, starting back in mid 90s, I want to say 96, 98 timeframe. I actually was having breakfast next to him when he was in Chicago, getting ready to go on the Geraldo show with his wife. And I watched the show, and they had mentioned that he is researching Go4 illness. And back then, there was no email. I found him, sent letters, and I've been following his research and following him ever since.
Well, Dr. Nicolson, give us a little backstory about, when you first started doing the researching and when you started realizing there was something wrong with the Go4 veterans.
Well, basically, it started with my daughter, who served in the Gulf War. She was a crew chief on a Black Hawk helicopter in the 101st Airborne Division. And when she came back, her health started to fail, and nobody could figure out why. At the time, she got through warrant officer school, but she was training to be a pilot and couldn't pass the physical. So she ended up leaving the Army and went to medical school instead. So she later became a MD PhD in neurosciences with a medical degree, specializing in dealing with childhood disorders, neurologic disorders. So in her case, it worked out all right because we were around to help her through her health difficulties. And not only because of her, because of our other contacts, mainly through the Navy SEALs. And I had some friends also that I'd made in the 101st Airborne that my daughter was serving in. And they all had health problems from the Gulf War. And so I realized at the time that there was something very wrong and nobody was doing anything about it. The only thing they were doing was claiming that it was psychological, and I knew that wasn't the case. I mean, you know your own family members. And I knew in her case that wasn't the situation at all. Plus that made a number of friends along the way, and I knew their health problems were not due to psychological issues, so it had to be something medically. And at the time, I was a professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at the MD Anderson Cancer Center and ran a research department. So I had the tools available to me to investigate it. And so I started taking a look at this. And the first thing I did was figured out that nobody really knows very much about this illness at all. And the DOD at the time was not claiming it was an illness at all. They claimed it was psychological. And so we knew that we had to do something to counter that effort. And so we ended up doing a study on 650 Gulf War veterans, looking at their signs and symptoms and showing that it wasn't a psychological problem. They had real medical problems and multiple medical problems, medical issues, and that it's had similarity to some known illnesses, fatiguing illnesses, in terms of the profile, the signs and symptoms profile. So about that time, I published a couple of papers on this. It's indicating that we didn't feel it was a psychological disorder at all. And in environmental medicine journals picked it up and published the articles. And so that's where I started. And then after that, it became necessary to figure out what was wrong with these people. So with the signs and symptoms profile, we could eliminate a number of different things. And that was very useful. But there are other things that we couldn't eliminate, so we had to start investigating them. And one of the avenues that I decided to take was infectious disease. And the reason for that is because of the time that it occurred, the exposures, and so on and so forth. It had similarities to certain chronic infections. So that was one of the first things that we started to look at. Well, let's see if there's a chronic infection that's involved here. Let's start looking at chronic infections. And I go through this in my book, Project Daylily. And so we, one by one, started ruling them in or ruling them out. And we got down to the bottom of the list after ruling most of these chronic infections out. I won't go into the details. It's more in the book if people are interested. But we settled on to looking at an unusual microorganism called mycoplasma. And sure enough, it popped up in over half of the Gulf War veterans that we looked at who were ill, showed signs and symptoms. So we thought that, well, this wasn't a universal explanation. And it was doubtful that there was any universal explanation anyway, because of the different exposures, different locations of people, different histories, and so on. And their signs and symptoms profiles were always slightly different. But there was a large group of them that had pretty much similar signs and symptoms and deployment issues and so on and so forth. And turns out those are the ones that were positive for this microorganism. And I won't go through a lot of the time and effort that we put into devising new laboratory tests to find this, because these organisms are very difficult to find. And this one was extremely difficult. And we had to go through 2 or 3 generations of tests before we could reliably detect it. So putting that aside for the moment, so we found that there was an infection involved. That gave us a clue as to what we could use to treat it. And so we made some recommendations. And I published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association on possible treatments of Gulf War illnesses. And sure enough, a lot of the people that tried these recommendations started to slowly recover. But it was a very slow process. It wasn't anything that was very rapid at all. And since that time, I've gone on to do additional investigations on this microorganism, and we found it in some unusual places. We found it in autistic children, for example, and not the same infection that we found in the Gulf War veterans, which is interesting, but a similar infection. Similar meaning the genus was the same, but the species was different. In the US, childhood pneumonia, a very frequent cause of that is the atypical pneumonia is mycoplasma. And it's primarily Mycoplasma pneumoniae, which we didn't find in the veterans. So it wasn't that mycoplasma. We found a different type of mycoplasma in the veterans. And that was called Mycoplasma fermentans when we finally identified the species, which was a very unusual infection, very rare at the time, but since then it had become much more common. So we thought, well, if mycoplasma might be contributing, we didn't think it was the sole cause of the problem, but contributing to the disease, there are some fairly simple treatments that we can recommend. We did. made that recommendation in publications and when people asked us. And sure enough, a lot of the people that we were in contact with slowly recovered from their illness. So that goes back to the story of the infections in Gulf War illness, but there was a large segment of veterans who probably did not have this infection because again, we found it in about 45% of the veterans. And so there was a large segment, a large group that had something else as their principal problem. So we started to think about chemicals as the other main contributor to Gulf War illnesses. And I had been working over the years on some natural supplements that would slowly correct mitochondrial problems. So the mitochondria are the little batteries inside our cells, and practically every chronic illness, these little batteries are damaged. And this leads to fatigue, and which is one of the main symptoms of Gulf War illness is fatigue. So it stands to reason that this was one of the problems. And so sure enough, when we looked at Gulf War veterans, we also found their mitochondria were damaged. And so what this natural supplement did was repair what's called the inner mitochondrial membrane. Now it turns out that's important because that particular membrane has a electrical potential across the membrane, and that has to be maintained in order to make high energy molecules like ATP. So that's the reason why you have mitochondria, is to produce ATP, which is about 80 to 90% of the ATP in our cells are produced by our mitochondria. So mitochondrial damage, we don't have the ATP, and a lot of the functions of cells can't be maintained without that ATP. So we found that this supplement helped restore the inner mitochondrial membrane potential, and it was a lipid supplement. And the reason for that is that basically the inner membrane of the mitochondria gets damaged by oxidative free radicals. Without going into details, these are things that are produced during injury and disease, and they can damage our cell membranes. And I'm kind of an expert on membranes. As a matter of fact, the model you read in the textbooks is my model of 1972 on biological membranes. So if you go to any medical textbook or biology textbook and open it up to cell membranes, you'll see the Singer-Nicholson fluid mosaic model of membranes. And that's what my main focus of research over the years had been. And it still is, actually. I just did an update on that model, 50-year update on that model, just being published. So back to the mitochondria. So repairing the mitochondria turned out to be very important. So it wasn't just the fact that if you had a chemical exposure or if you had an infection, your mitochondria were damaged and you couldn't produce the energy and you had fatigue and other symptoms because of that. How do you repair that? And so we started using what I call membrane lipid replacement to repair the membranes of the mitochondria. Now, over the years, we've found that there's a simple way to do this, and that's to take isolated membrane molecules and package them up in a kind of a protective coat and take them in as food, because we have a natural mechanism for scavenging these molecules. They're very important molecules. So we've developed a whole transport network inside our bodies to not only transport these molecules in, but to send them to the right places and incorporate them into membranes of cells to repair them when they're damaged. So that's what this natural supplement actually does, is it repairs the damage to various membranes of the cell. And there are a lot of advantages to it. It's all natural, it's very safe. In fact, we use it with children, autistic children. Remember, I told you that they have infections and other exposures, chemical exposures as well. And I could go into a long story about a group of autistic children up in Central California. They were exposed to chemicals because they were in a farming community, and they all had autism spectrum disorders because of it. And we were able to slowly remove chemicals from these young children using these natural supplements. So my most recent work, and I sent on a publication that we just published in the International Journal of Translational Medicine on using these natural supplements to remove chemicals from Gulf War veterans, even years after they've been exposed. A lot of these chemicals are absorbed and you never get rid of them. They build up in your body, mostly in the lipid stores in your cells.
Is that, hey, Doc, I want to ask you a question because you mentioned things build up in your body. Would that explain why some of us takes a while before we start having problems that we can't explain?
Yeah, there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, if it's a biologic exposure, like an infection, like I mentioned, it takes time for those to be manifest, the problems.
Okay.
If it's a chemical, and most of the chemicals that were absorbed by the Gulf War veterans came from chemical exposures, anything from burn pits to chemical weapons, a lot of different types of chemicals, but primarily these are petrochemicals, and they're slowly absorbed into cells. And when they get in cells, some of it bleeds out, and some of these chemicals can cause problems with a variety of different important mechanisms inside of cells. So we have to be protected from that. So it can take time for this to manifest itself after the exposure. It doesn't necessarily happen quickly, although it can, depending upon the dose. There were plenty of veterans who I've worked with who were exposed to very high doses of chemicals for one reason or another, mostly because of either chemical spills or acute exposures in the field. And in their case, we have to use more drastic detoxification methods to help them remove those chemicals. But in the case of most veterans, their signs and symptoms came on rather slowly after their exposure, usually within the first 6 months after they're back from deployment. They were showing signs and symptoms, but often not immediately, although there are exceptions. And during that time period, there are a number of things that could happen. Number one, the chemicals that you've absorbed can undergo change. And some of those changes can render those molecules that you've stored inside your cells more toxic than they were initially. And this can be a problem. They can leach out from their storage sites inside of cells. And again, that could lead to problems. Without going into the details on that, what we have been using, which again, I've worked out over the last 20 years or so, is a natural supplement that's made from plant membrane lipids. And we take these plant membrane lipids and we isolate the lipids. And then the secret is that we protect them using another plant molecule or set of molecules called inulins. It's not too important, but what they are. But what they do is they protect the membrane lipids from being oxidatively damaged, which is one of the major problems that occurs with the membrane lipids. They also protect them from temperature damage. And in fact, the reason we use these molecules called inulins is because these are in temperature resistant plants. For example, trees that can exist in the Arctic Circle, you wonder, well, how can they stand those freezing temperatures over long periods of time? Their cells would freeze, but the cells have a little antifreeze in them, but also their membranes would be damaged, but the membranes have these inulins in them to protect them. So these are molecules which protect the membrane lipids. So because of that, we added some of these inulin molecules to our lipid formulation, not only for their protection during storage, so we can keep them much longer, they have a longer shelf life because of it, but also they're protected during their ingestion and during their absorption in the small intestine. They're not absorbed in the gut, they're absorbed in the small intestine. And during their transport, because we give a pretty large dose pretty much at once. And as humans have evolved, we've developed these transport mechanisms for these important molecules, because as hunter-gatherers, we probably only had a source of these lipids like animal fats and animal membranes once every few weeks when we made a kill. And other than that, we just had plants, and you can't eat enough plants, it turns out, to supply enough of these important molecules. So you have to supplement with animal
So,
membranes.
so this product, there's a product available to people that suffer from the chronic fatigue, in large part because of your research then, yes?
Yes, and we've published now about 50 papers on this, so it's well researched, well documented, and the safety is unprecedented, particularly for remedies and this and that. I mean, this is one of the safest things that you can take, period. We've used this in children, we've used this in elderly, we've used this in adults, teenagers, whatever, it doesn't matter. These are very safe molecules. They're what's in our membranes already. So there's nothing unusual about it. We just get these from plants, and we isolate them from plants, and we formulate them with inulin to protect them. And we put in some antioxidants so they don't get oxidized, and all natural antioxidants. So all this is all natural, which is
Okay.
good, and it's incredibly safe. We've never seen any toxicity in all our clinical studies.
But this is available to the public to buy, yes, now?
It is.
And can I ask you what that is, please?
It's called NT factor lipids.
Okay, because I think that's incredibly important to the very group of people that's watching this, because I personally have tried it and it certainly helped me. So thank you. It certainly helped.
So that's one of the things that we've been doing. And I mentioned my most recent study on this, just published in the International Journal of Translational Medicine, where we took 16 Gulf War veterans who were chemically exposed and had very severe symptoms and had been pretty much incapacitated since a few months after the Gulf War. Again, these are not things that occur immediately. They're not acute problems or chronic issues. And they had a number of different issues. And without going into a lot of details on it, we were able to show that 6 months treatment with the NT factor lipids at 6 grams per day resulted in very significant reductions in their severity of their signs and symptoms. So, for example, some of them had breathing problems, they had fatigue problems, some of them had pain. And we've been using this for pain. Another area that I work in are gunshot wounds. And this is a very useful supplement for anybody with a gunshot wound, for example, because it helps repair the tissues that are damaged, but it also removes the toxic materials that such damage is associated with. So there are a number of different uses for this. As I mentioned, we use this in autistic children to not only remove the chemicals that causes these autistic spectrum disorders, but it also helps them in terms of regeneration of damaged tissues and helps them in their growth, for example. So there are a number of uses for this. We found it's particularly useful.
Well, I mean, it was due to Wade. Wade suggested it to me. I'm always a little apprehensive about putting something in my body, but he kind of explained the background and where it came from, how it came into play. And I know there's a powder and there's a pill. And well,
the good news is it's in your body already.
Oh,
we're not putting anything in. We're not putting a drug into your body. We're only putting in the molecules that are there already, but they're damaged.
Oh,
we've got to get rid of those damaged molecules because they cause a lot of problems. Without getting too much medical or scientific detail, these damaged molecules build up in your body and they cause a lot of problems. And they have to be removed. Your membranes have to be repaired. Your mitochondria have to be repaired, but also the other membranes of your cell that I didn't go into, like the plasma membrane or exterior membrane of each cell has these same molecules. The nuclear membrane has these same molecules. All the membranes of the cells have these same molecules. And a lot of the activity in your cells goes on membranes. A lot of the enzymes, for example, and the enzymatic reactions go on membranes. The synthesis of everything that the cell needs, from the DNA or the genetic material to all the proteins that we need, to that all goes on. The synthesis goes on membranes associated. Those synthetic mechanisms are associated with membranes. So the machinery are in the membrane.
Well, I think it's,
If our membranes are damaged, a number of things could happen. We can accumulate a lot of problems. So
Well,
now to get to the aspect of the detoxification, because that's what I've been working on right now, using these anti-factor lipids. We just up the dose a bit, and not only repair the mitochondrial membranes, but we also provide a mechanism for removal of these toxic molecules, because it turns out what happens is that if we build up the amount of these membrane components inside cells, they form little tiny globules, little tiny lipid globules that float around the cell. And those globules will naturally exchange with the membrane lipids and the chemicals as well in your cell. And so it turns out we can set up a situation where we will slowly, like a conveyor belt, remove these dangerous chemicals from your body. It just takes a long time.
can
It's
you,
a natural process.
so Dr. Nicholson, how long, when a person, as you just explained, which I think is a really key part here, is that we're not putting anything new into our body, it's already there. And that being said, because I've noticed the difference, and I clearly Wade has noticed the difference, as you're taking these things, is this something you need to take basically on a consistent basis to just, or is it take and then there's a period of time that you can refrain from using it, or is it something you should?
Well,
consistently take?
unfortunately, you've got to continue taking it,
Okay,
because this conveyor belt, if you don't feed the new molecules in, the unoxidized or undamaged molecules into the conveyor belt, they don't get to where they're needed, and you're not able to remove the damaged molecules out the other way.
okay,
So you've got to keep replacing the damaged molecules with undamaged molecules. And if you have contaminants, chemical contaminants inside your cells, those have to be removed, and they're not all removed at once. In fact, if you remove them too quickly, you get severely sick.
oh,
So
okay.
so that
I know-
you have a double benefit to using this stuff that's slow is better.
I
And
know
if you
Kevin
don't-
was going to ask you something, Doc, not to interrupt, but I know he had a question for you. If you
Oh yeah, I got a few questions. I'm sure Sarah's over there going, I got some too on this. And so I'll ask mine, then I want Sarah to ask hers. But my question is, what about neurological? People with neurological, like I suffer from neuropathy really bad.
I am really interested in this. I'm doing some work with a group in South America who are specializing in peripheral neuropathies, for example, and nerves in general. And I was very interested in pain, because we found out that these anti-factor lipids, if used in a high enough dose, could start to blunt pain. And I wanted to find out the mechanism for this. I knew it had to be membranes. It turns out we found that there are certain membrane channels in our nerve cells, and the channels are the things that the ions go through. And so if your nerve cell fires, it causes what's called a depolarization. And so these little channels in our membranes allow certain ions like calcium and potassium to move through the membrane. And this causes a change in the transmembrane potential, electrical potential. Depolarization is what occurs. And that is a nerve impulse, and that moves along the nerve, and then it's passed to another nerve. And we'll go into the details on it because it's a lot more complicated than that. But what this does is it helps repair these channels that are actually damaged. And when they're damaged, the resting potential of our nerve cells is modified, and those nerves fire much more easily. And that's one of the problems of people with chronic pain. Their nerves are firing all the time. And that, if they're pain nerves, then it gives a sensation of pain. So what do we do about that? Instead of drugging you in your central nervous system, one of the things you can do is to repair the damage to the nerves to these channels. And that's what we've done, because it turns out to make the channels work right, the lipids, the membrane lipids, have to be intact, not modified, and they have to surround certain types of these lipids, surround these membrane channels and stabilize it. And when those are damaged, these channels become unstable, and they can't pump the ions through the channel and can't maintain the electrical potential of the membrane, and they get depolarized too easily. So that's
Yeah,
what we
but
found. And so when people have pain, we give them higher doses of the anti-factor lipids, and it starts to blunt that pain. And that's from my work on gunshot wounds, for example, and some other things. And so there's so many different uses of this stuff. It's just unbelievable. So we found that this helps with pain. It helps with neurologic symptoms because it helps repair the nerves. It helps with digestive symptoms because it helps repair the epithelia in the gut, gets damaged, and it causes leaky gut. With leaky gut, you get all kinds of infections and stuff that enter the body, and this causes autoimmune type of reactions to occur. There's all kinds of things that go wrong when you get leaky gut. So this helps seal up the epithelial membranes in the small intestine and help solve that problem. And so there are a number of different things that it helps solve. And so we found that the Gulf War veterans, for example, who had these chemical exposures, and they had breathing problems, they had fatigue problems, they had pain problems, they had gastrointestinal problems, they had all these different, they had sleep problems, all these different problems. And all of a sudden, they started to slowly but surely recover from all these different situations on just this one natural supplement. Now, we haven't gotten all the way yet, but certainly there is significant improvements in the signs and symptoms in all these different issues, from breathing to pain to gastrointestinal to all kinds of other problems, neuromuscular problems, gut problems, issues of memory, cognitive problems, all kinds of different problems were benefited by these anti-factor lipids. But it took time, and most people don't have the patience to see it through. But the ones that did have done extremely well on these lipids. So this is kind of a natural approach to solving medical problems.
right, of course with that, because oh hell, you know, I lived with mine for now over 15 years. I think I could slowly wait for it to finally heal because my feet burn 24/7. But I know Sarah is just itching to ask a question. And Sarah, I want the floor to be yours on this.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Nicholson, for coming on the podcast today and giving your knowledge to us. Through your research of Gulf War illness, otherwise known now as chronic multi-symptom illness, as a result of what the VA has found that who it affects, have you seen any patterns of behavior in those individuals and veterans who are considered to be vaccine injured from the VA standpoint as a result of something we're still trying to determine? Hypothesis is that it's due to the adjuvants placed in the anthrax vaccine. One of those adjuvants, we believe, is the squalene adjuvant, otherwise known as MF59 in the chemical standpoint. Have you seen any similar patterns of behavior in mitochondrial damage, or have you spoken to any of your colleagues about this possibility and the fellow veterans that didn't deploy?
Well, one of the things that we found was that the only veterans who were damaged, who came up with Gulf War issues or multi-symptom illnesses, were those that were vaccinated and not deployed. And it turns out there were a small number of veterans that we followed who were not vaccinated and were deployed either by accident, by mistake, because their records I guess they didn't follow them. These were mostly special forces, Navy SEALs, for example, who were deployed very quickly and were not vaccinated. And they didn't have the issues with Gulf War illness, even though they were in country. So I'm working separately with a group in Denmark of vaccine injured civilians. So they don't have the issue of chemicals or other exposures due to the situation of war environment. They just have the one problem of having vaccinations, and they were injured because of the vaccinations and were sick. And we've used the anti-factor lipids on them as well, and they've done extremely well on that. So we've seen civilians as well that are doing quite well. I mentioned the autistic children. some autistic children become autistic after their childhood vaccines. And although this is a contentious issue because there's no agreement on this, and they don't like to talk about this because this opens up a hornet's nest, as you can imagine. But we have looked at some of these children, and we've given them the anti-factor lipids. These are colorless, odorless, tasteless lipids that are put in their applesauce or their food. You know, it doesn't really matter how they give it, but it's very easy to give to children. And that's one of the reasons that we were able to use it with children. So they've done extremely well on it, and we think for a number of reasons. And one is it's repairing the membranes, and two is it's removing slowly the chemicals that in some of these kids were the cause of their problems. And number three, repairs the damage caused by infections. And these are the big issues in children with autism and autistic spectrum disorders. So I think there are a number of other situations, neurologic conditions, for example, that would benefit from this. I also think that memory loss, for example, and other problems would benefit from this. And we've done not some extensive studies on this, but some preliminary studies showing that long-term use of the anti-factor lipids will improve cognition and so on. And it makes sense because other membrane lipids that have been used in such studies have also shown benefits. So it's very consistent with those findings. So there's nothing unusual about it. It's very, very consistent with what's known in the medical literature. It's just that what we use as the starting product contains a wide variety of different membrane lipids. So we can get much more benefit than just using one membrane lipid. It's just you have to use higher doses. But that doesn't seem to be a drawback. So to answer your question, yes, it has helped vaccine injured people, non-veterans, for example, who are vaccine injured. It's helped them considerably with a number of different health issues. I don't think it's a panacea. That is, it's not something that you're going to take the supplement and it's a miracle 1 week later you're cured. Number one, with these chronic illnesses, there is no such thing as a cure. We can improve people's lives, but people continue to get exposed to dangerous chemicals in their environment, just living. And they continue to have bad eating habits and so on. And so they continue to put junk in their bodies, and we can't stop them from doing that either. So a lot of these issues just take time.
So as a patient, how do we present this information to our doctors and our medical team as wanting to use this product as a potential therapy?
Well, just if you send me an email, I'll be glad to send you a list of the 50 publications and how to download them. Most of them are, all the recent ones were all in open access journals, so they can be downloaded very easily. I can't send papers around to everybody. That's impractical. So I started a few years ago publishing only in open access journals so that everybody could read it. So for the last 20 years, all the publications are in open access journals. So I give the list and the URL under the publication so people can just click on that and get a download. They can download whatever they want. So that's principally how we're getting the information out. There's a couple of veterans have started a new website called NT-Factor or NT-Factor Lipids, one of the two. And that will be, I don't know, coming online sometime soon. The Institute for Molecular Medicine I started in 1996, has its own website, and a lot of the Go4 publications are on that website. You can download them from there. It's just like my email, immed.org, and they can find a lot of information on veterans' illnesses and other illnesses, like fatiguing illnesses, for example, neurobehavioral illnesses. I mentioned autism, a variety of other conditions as well. So that's a source of information. And the little company that I've worked with over the years called Nutritional Therapeutics. It's on Long Island. They have their website as well, which is called ntfactor.com. And you can find a lot of information on their website as well. And that's how people can purchase the lipids. I usually try, and when veterans contact me and they have a problem, they have an issue, they can't afford to buy any medications because of their situation. So I usually make a little arrangements to get them a supply to start with, at least to see if they're going to respond nicely to it. And so far, all of them have. And then after a certain point, they're going to have to figure out how to get it themselves, because there's a limit to how much we can give away. I tried to talk this company into giving away everything they can to veterans. And so they've made a pledge that the president was a Vietnam veteran. So he's been backing me the whole way. He knows the importance of this. So that's why we're able to do that. And so there are a number of benefits. But the biggest benefit of all is that this stuff is safe. It's safe for children, safe for the elderly, safe for people that are sick, even severely sick. It just has not caused an issue, not caused a problem. And I guess there are 40 million doses of this have been, it's probably 50 million now, have been taken without health issues. So it's pretty safe. You can't look at any drug on the market and see that kind of safety record. But it's safe because these are the molecules that are in your cells already. We're not inventing a wheel here. This is simply using nature to help heal. And I think that's the best way to approach the problem.
Oh, I like that. I like that. And, I mean, I saw Wade. He was first one. Ooh, jump up that end real quick and everything. So Wade, you're going to be doing a store and kind of guiding people through this, because one thing, my question would be, I think most questions would be, do you start off on a small dose, they go to a bigger dose, or is it just one dose all the way around?
Well, in some of my reviews, I've actually put up a big chart of, 40 different illnesses and what doses we recommend and so on. And this has changed over the years. And for example, you don't recommend the same dose to a child that you recommend to an adult with severe chemical exposure, for example. So they're the extremes. So somebody, an adult, a veteran, for example, who had very severe chemical exposure, has been sick for the last 20 years or more, we go to pretty high doses of these lipids because it takes that to get this conveyor belt moving and to slowly remove those chemicals that are causing damage. And if we don't put a high enough dose in, if we start to leach out the chemicals, they can cause illness themselves. So we want to protect them. We want to surround them with these membrane lipids. And that's what we figured out the way to do it. So also certain symptoms like pain, for example, requires a higher dose than fatigue. That's because we can repair the mitochondria with a lower dose, but it won't affect the pain because that requires a higher dose. And it turns out these little channels that I mentioned in the nerve membranes require some very specific membrane lipids that surround them and protect them. And they're turned out to be, they're not the majority membrane lipid in the cocktail. They're a minor fraction of it. So it requires a much higher dose to get the amount that you need. So there's an explanation for essentially all the observations that we've made using these natural membrane lipids. So we're just been working through this the last 20 years or so, and making what I consider to be pretty good headway.
Yeah, I want Wade to talk about this because I mean, I know he's a firm believer in it.
I researched it for a long time, and I was hesitant because of the price. I was fortunate enough to receive a 6-month supply from Dr. Nicolson, and after that, I've been on it over a year out of my own pocket, like he says. It's expensive, what I consider expensive.
Well, it is, but that's part of our problem. If I tell you, if we start really selling this stuff in huge quantities, the price will go down dramatically. But right now, it's an issue of purity, getting the pure components. They have to go through a purification process. They have to be protected. All this has to be done under you know, very rigorous conditions. And it's just expensive to do that. But it's not nearly as expensive as a drug that you would buy, for example, from a big pharma. By the way, big pharma
Right.
hates this. They absolutely hate me because this is too simple for them. You know, they want a patentable product, and you can't patent this because it's already in your cells. You know, it's already there. It's a natural component, so you can't patent it. You can patent the process, which we've done, but you can't
Yep.
patent the molecules. So
Yeah.
there's some lookalike products that are coming out. Not nearly the quality of the stuff that I've been associated with, but that's the downside of this. Is that once it starts to get going, believe me, there'll be so many lookalikes out there with cheap products that'll be a lot less expensive to buy, but not effective. And it turns out you have to be really careful about these, or these lipids get damaged very easily, and you've got to really figure this out.
Well, and like you explained to me in the past, I use the powder. The powder's by far the most economical. One jar lasts 30 days, give or take. So, you know, but people can give something up to get better, to get healthy.
Yeah,
How much is
considering
one jar?
What's that, Sarah?
How much is one jar of the powder for 30 days?
You can find it anywhere from 64 up to 90. The website, like Dr. Nicholson was talking about, NTF Factor, they give a discount if you do like an auto ship. Amazon has it. I believe there's 3 companies labeling it right now.
that's correct. There are at least 3.
Yep.
And
But it's
the latest one that's going
you
to pick
can,
it up is Amway. So
oh no,
I don't
that's
know
not,
what's
no.
going to happen with that. Once they get a hold of it, who knows what's going to happen. So
Yeah.
I'm not all for that. So
Yeah.
I'm a believer in you go to the source. Myself, I like to order it from the website. That's just me. I know what I'm getting.
yeah, there are a couple of other companies that use the same source and put it in their products, and those I recommend. One is called Research Nutritionals.
Isn't
And
there
they
a,
have,
yep,
Santa
allergy
Barbara.
research and nutrology?
Yeah, well, Nutricology sells it, and they get it directly from Nutritional Therapeutics. So that's okay. That's an okay
Yeah.
source.
No, and
So
I've used all 3 and with no problem.
yeah, there's some sources that are completely okay, and other sources not. And there's out some new lookalike things that are out on the market, which are junk, frankly.
Right.
I'm going to get a bad name because of that. I'm really upset about that.
No,
Well, I think my question for everybody is on this one is to me, I don't think that's a bad cost. I mean, heck, I mean, for you to get feeling better and everything else, but when you go in, like, do you take like a little survey about what your pain is and all that stuff? And then that's how they determine the amount that you would have to take? Or is it a paperwork that they give you?
like he explained, Kevin, they actually have research done on different conditions. And like Gulf War veterans are inside this whole list. And so whatever you're taking it for, you can go right down that list and say, you know, this is me. This is what they recommend for me to take per day. And it's just a little chart. And it's right on the website. So
Yeah, they've updated that chart. In fact, I published a paper last year in a journal called Membranes. It's very prestigious. And it had a table in there on all the conditions that we've worked with, including Gulf War veterans. And it gives a recommended dose, adjusted recommended dose, because actually we've had to adjust the doses over time. So a lot of different conditions are listed in there. I won't go through them, but I've mentioned a few situations where we've used it. And I did mention that, for example, for children, you don't use the same dose as you use for adults. And if a child with autism, you don't use the same dose as you use with an adult with chemical exposure. So again, all different situations here, the situations of age, illness, and so on. So, you know, that's that's some of what we've done. The other benefit of this, if you use this long term, is that one of the studies that we did was we looked at markers for cardiac disease. And one of the markers I was very interested in was homocysteine. So homocysteine is a blood marker that will predict whether you're going to go to the hospital because of a heart attack and whether you're going to survive or not. So the levels of homocysteine in your blood are really quite accurate at predicting whether you will survive a heart attack or not. So we've given patients that had levels of homocysteine in the danger zone. So these were people that were on the course for heart attack and hospitalization and death due to coronary disease, arteriosclerosis, and coronary disease in general. So what we did was we were able to slowly pull them back into the normal zone from this very high level to normal level. And none of those people had heart attacks. They've gone on for years now without having a heart attack, and they were predicted to have a heart attack within 6 months. So there's some added benefits of this stuff. And to make the long story short, that's what prompted me to get into using this with chemically exposed Gulf War veterans, because we were removing some of the really bad stuff like oxidized cholesterol, for example, that can lead to eventually build up and heart problems. And we were slowly removing that using, fairly reasonable levels of the anti-factor lipids. So this thought, well, maybe we can take chemically damaged people who've stored these chemicals in their body and slowly remove them as well. And it turns out that that works. So one of the benefits, if you're online for a heart attack, you can pull yourself back from that by removing the oxidized cholesterol and other problem molecules from your cells and from your heart, and recover function that way. So, there's, again, the benefits are many.
So Dr. Nicholson, to kind of go back from the beginning, so those people that might have joined late, what, at least in part, your daughter was in the military. She came back from the Gulf War with issues, and you knew that something wasn't right. And this was at least in part that got you to try or down the road to figure out what was causing her issues, at least to a degree.
Well, that gave me, because of that, it was a red light to me, and I had already had contact with other veterans in my family and other places. So, but it really rang my bell. Let's put it that way, and
Okay.
it forced me to devote a certain amount of my research effort in this area, and I've done that ever since 1991. And this is the upshot of it. This is the one thing that we came up with, aside for the infections that we found. This is the one long-term solution to the damage that I've come up with, and it seems to, not a panacea, but it seems to be extremely beneficial.
Now, so Wade, I'm going to bring this up because I think anybody that is listening to Dr. Nicholson and listen to this conversation, I myself have purchased this product and have found it to be of value. I see my energy level, like Wade explained to me, Dr. Nicholson, when I was taking, I said, what can I expect? And he says, well, you can expect more energy, but it's not like you've taken a caffeine drink. It's nothing like that remotely. It's just, you feel better. And I ask, and I'm not even sure I asked, Wade explained to me, you'll know it's working when you, I don't know how else to put it. When you have a bowel movement, the bowel movement will be coated a little bit in white. Is that correct?
Well, that's because a lot of the lipids go out in the stool.
Okay.
In fact, that's how we remove the chemicals. The chemicals are, so remember I mentioned this conveyor belt process is the way I like to explain it to people. And the chemicals come out in the conveyor belt and they go back into the small intestine and they pumped out in the stool. So if you're taking several grams of this per day, you're going to have much better bowel movements, much more reasonable bowel movements, and much easier bowel movements. And the chemicals will come out And some of the vets, when they first start using this, they can actually smell the chemicals in their stool, believe it or not.
Wow, okay.
So that's an extreme case. So usually
Well,
the levels are so low that you can't smell them.
I guess I thought that was worth mentioning because we all have enough going on in our bodies, and then to see that on our bowels, we might kind of freak out. And so I thought it was important to share that information.
Oh, I freaked out, John. I
They
said,
did?
I'll let y'all know right now. I'll probably still freak out. I'm just letting y'all know right now. And I ain't the one that brought that part of this conversation up,
Well,
so
it
I
had to
just
be
don't
said.
leave it alone.
I had to be. No, I'm like
Sarah,
no, you gotta
you're
know.
sitting there all nice and quiet. I'm changing the subject before I get in trouble. So
Well, look, one of the problems that we have in our advanced civilization is that we don't eat enough plant roughage and so on to keep our bowels moving adequately. So this helps with that. So believe me, people who are on this supplement don't have those problems. Now, it's not that they have diarrhea. They don't have diarrhea. It's not diarrhea. Their stools are soft, so they're coming out much more easily. So that's basically like a stool softener when you have these lipids around. And so you eliminate, you go to the bathroom much more easily. You have formed but easily extrudable stool. And because of that, the lipids that contain the contaminants are eliminated in the stool. So that's a nice thing about it, is that you don't have to go through dialysis or any extreme sorts of medical procedures to get rid of the chemicals. It's a natural process.
right, and I do like the fact that you brought up that this is even for people with vaccine injuries.
Yes.
This is people that have autism kids or who is autism. But Sarah, do you have any questions?
Well, I just wanted to state that as a cannabis patient that has been paying out of pocket for medication since 2008, I can assure you that this cost is very much effective and a rate that I think is a much affordable rate for somebody that would need it on the daily. Cannabis, as a result of becoming legalized in many states, has become more cost effective. But because the fact that it has become decriminalized, there's a lot of other capitalization going on to get those monies where they can from the cannabis products. So with that being said, Dr. Nichols, is there a way that we can have you potentially use our vaccine injured group of veterans as a peer-to-peer or whatever, what have you, type of research to determine that this product is very useful for the vaccine injured, as we have seen?
Well, I could tell you in my publication in the International Journal of Translational Medicine, all of those veterans received the multiple military vaccines during employment, including the anthrax vaccine, 100%.
Yes.
So there's a group right there.
But they were also deployed with that environmental factor. Is that correct?
They were also deployed with the environmental factors. So, but results.
Would you benefit from doing another research like the Denmark individuals that are vaccine injured?
Well, Denmark and the group in Denmark that we looked at were vaccine damaged individuals who had adverse reactions from their vaccines, have been sick long term because of their vaccinations, and we've had some very, very nice recoveries from there. But I haven't published those results because I don't have those patients in front of me. I can't evaluate those patients. The feedback has been very good, but it's not scientific. Now, the veterans who went through my study, by the way, they had to fill out all these illness survey forms, 120 signs and symptoms, and they had to do this starting 1 week and 1 month and 3 months, 6 months, so on. So I had a lot of detailed information on those. So that was a publishable result. But with the Denmark study, it wasn't publishable because they were essentially a non-controlled study.
Would you see value in, would you be available to conduct an additional research to get that data so that we can show our US Congress why it's so critical that we have vaccine injury research and do something about this issue?
Sure, I could do something on that. I tell you, it's very hard to get funding for this. I had to fund the veteran study myself, uh, which wasn't
Yes,
cheap.
sir. It is very difficult. It's been extremely difficult for us to get funding for research as well. Anytime you say anything that has to do with vaccine injury, no one wants to put their name on it.
Exactly.
But this is a very
Exactly.
beneficial therapy, I think, as a result of this COVID vaccine mandatory issue. We are now having a lot more individuals that are vaccine injured across the world globally. So I think it'd be very beneficial for Operation Truth to assist your group in getting that fund. And because we are a 501c3, I believe that organizations would be willing to assist.
Well, that assistance would be absolutely necessary to move into this area, because I would need to have a group, for example, that we had the information on them, and people who are not taking a lot of other drugs as well. That was one of the things that I had to eliminate a lot of people from my veteran studies, because they were on all kinds of different stuff, and that gets to be too complicated. So you can't
Okay.
find anybody that isn't on something. That wasn't the issue. The issue was on materials that would potentially interfere with the results. So that was the situation. So yeah, all that can be worked out. It's just time and effort and money.
I definitely would like to speak with you further on this topic. I think we would have a large population of individuals that would be willing, more than willing, to be part of this study.
Okay. No, I'm certainly willing to do it.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Nicholson. I think this is going to be a great partnership. And if we can make it work, it's going to help a lot of fellow veterans and civilians that are vaccine injured.
Man, not only that, it's going to help a lot of other veterans in the future. And I mean, that's what I truly believe. That's one of the reasons why we have this round table. And we like to bring, doctors on like yourself, is to come out and be able to tell people, look, you know what, there is hope. And a lot of the veterans, the Gulf War veterans, feel like there is no hope because of the VA. But there is. People need I tell everybody, most of everything in life is your attitude. And you got to be willing to try it, give it that chance, and have a positive attitude.
It's not easy though. Let me give you an example. I had a group of Navy SEALs, a SEAL team that was deployed in the mountains in Afghanistan, and they were having issues because of going up to high altitude. Of course, your mitochondria are not as effective because you don't have the oxygen levels that you require. So I told them, look, one way to improve that is to improve the efficiency of the mitochondria. And one way to do that is to make sure the membranes are optimal to take this product, anti-factor lipids. And so sure enough, I had a small number of these Navy SEALs the reason I have a contact, I took care of some of these Navy SEALs after the war, and they made me an honorary Navy SEAL. So I had kind of an
Oh, that's cool.
into them. So I knew the right people, the right commanders to contact. And in this case, the lieutenant commander was one of my first patients. And so he was a really gung-ho on this. And so they sent a team up in the Bora Bora mountains of Afghanistan, and they took enough of these anti-factor lipids to see what would happen. And sure enough, they claimed, because this group had been up before, this wasn't their first rodeo in the Bora Bora mountains. This is before bin Laden was found. And they were able to claim, at least, that they had better performance at high altitude, which makes sense because their mitochondrial function was improved. Yeah. So I tried to then go back, in this case, to the Army and tell them, well, you've got a whole division, the Mountain Division, 10th Mountain Division. It's supposed to be able to operate at high altitude in the mountains. What if we improve the ability of these soldiers to operate at high altitude? Would you be interested in that? And they said, oh yeah, we'd be interested. so they said, but it turns out they weren't that interested. So anyway, there's a long story about trying to convince the military that this is something that's really worthwhile and they should consider it prophylactically to help soldiers and sailors and airmen, because if they're ever deployed, they're going to need to be in peak condition and peak performance. So anyway,
Dr. Nicholson, I got a quick question. It's really not related to military per se, but you said this product is used in a lot of different benefits for various issues. Now you mentioned autistic children, autistic people. What does it do to a person with autism? How does it help them? I got a family member and other friends that I know that have autistic children, and I got you on the horn, so that's why I'm asking the question.
Well, for those autistic children who have their disease because of chemical damage, we know that it works. We had a group in Central California of children that were in an area where there was high pesticide use, and their autism was just linked very beautifully to pesticide use in the fields and everything that their parents were bringing it home, and they were walking through these fields on their way home from school and so on and so forth. So they had pesticide levels of way above normal in their systems, where we were able to help those autistic children by giving them these supplements. Okay, so that's one issue. Now, there's of course huge resistance to giving children anything, particularly anything that isn't given by a pediatrician. I'm not a pediatrician.
Right. What like teenagers or whatever? I mean,
well, again, it depends on what their issue is, how they became autistic in the first place.
Okay.
We concentrated on chemical damage, and as a secondary effect, infections, because I published a paper in a neuroscience journal showing that about half or more of autistic children have chronic infections that we can diagnose. And so we know that that's an issue. We know the chemicals are an issue, but it's the same thing that we've dealt with. There are infections involved. There are exposures, other exposures involved, and so on. So each patient is a bit different. And for patients that were exposed in mass, it's much easier to work with them than it is individual patients that could have a variety of different reasons why they're sick. So we've tried to focus on situations. I mentioned this one Northern California or Central California group of autistic children, because we knew they came from an area of high chemical exposure, and that was probably due to their autism. But interestingly, even in those children, they didn't really become fully autistic until after their childhood vaccines. So we knew that the vaccines played a role in this too. So I think in the Gulf War veterans, the vaccines play a role in their chemical issues as well. So it's not a simple problem.
But not only that, you also deal with like our children, because I know me and Wade have talked to like my daughter. Our daughter experienced the same thing, going to a hospital. They can't experience things. So, whatever we were exposed to, we had to give them a little bit of it. So, I mean, it'd even be probably beneficial for our kids to try it.
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
Okay.
And the good thing about it is it's totally safe for children. And that there are very few things that are really safe for children.
Well, anything's safe these days. and I mean, I'm hoping that Shelley, that runs the Go For Babies United, I really want to. I'm going to talk to her. I'm going to ask her to get a hold of me and listen to this program.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have a published study on Go For Children, but I can tell you that in the groups that we helped, they did benefit from it. The children benefited from it. And after the war, again, there are multiple issues, but the biggest issue with the autistic children in the Gulf War veterans group were the infections. because the veterans pass those infections to the children, and we were able to show that. So I published a paper on that, showing that in these veterans' families, where the family members, not only the children, but also the adults in the family, became ill after the veteran returned to the home. And
I've
we were
heard
able to
that.
pin that down to the infections that were passed between the veterans and their spouse and to the children. So
I got a question for you, Dr. Nicolson. Give or take, how many reports dealing with Gulf War illness have you actually published, and how many times have you testified before Congress?
well, let's see. I haven't counted up the Gulf War veterans papers, but there are probably a dozen or so papers that I published on veterans issues. A few more if you count the reviews that I've written. I've testified 4 times to Congress
Do you know of any other
on the issue of
researcher?
Gulf War illness.
Right. Do you know of any other researcher, any other institute that has the same number of published reports or have testified as you do?
I don't know of anybody that works on these environmental contamination issues that has anywhere near. I mean, I've got almost 700 publications in my career, but you know,
Right.
I'm 79 years old, so I've had a lot of time to do this. And I
Dr.
think-
Haley came out here a couple weeks ago, and they finally concluded after this long that they say that sarin is the cause. Well, I think sarin's a contributor. Is it the sole cause? No. I was
Yeah.
actually in Camisea. I was at the Camisea complex. I was inside of it. I was exposed to the sarin when it blew up. Is it a contributor? I believe that. Is it the cause? I don't. But my
I
thing
agree with
is,
you. By the way, I agree with you. It could contribute, but it's not the cause. But that's true to most things.
why are people not following you? I followed you since the mid '90s. I'll follow you to the end.
Well,
But
part of the problem is I had a huge falling out with the Army on this issue of the infections, and because of that, the VA kind of blacklisted me, even though I've
because
been
of the
volunteering on the COVID.
mycoplasma. Yep, they did the mycoplasma study with the DOD and the VA, and it didn't turn out into your favor.
Well, the
But-
reason is because it was sabotaged.
Well, I agree. I remember it. I followed the whole.
That study that the VA did was sabotaged, and I know that, and people on the inside have told me that, but I don't have criminal proof of that. But the problem with the infections that I don't have with the natural supplements, which is why I've gone totally into natural supplements, because I don't have this issue of having to fight with the Army on this, particularly the Institute of Pathology, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. They're the ones that did a lot of the work on the mycoplasma, the particular species that we found in the Gulf War veterans, and that's very embarrassing to them.
Now correct me if I'm wrong. M. fermentins incognitus,
Yes,
which you tested before back in '98,
fermentins.
and which I turned up positive for.
Yeah, that was the major issue, not the only issue, but the major issue with a lot of the Gulf War veterans, and explained why some of the veterans who were given the vaccines but not deployed, many of those came down with the illness, the same illness that a lot of the deployed personnel had. So, and it would explain why if you were deployed quickly and didn't get all the vaccines, that you didn't have the issue. So the French forces, for example, which didn't have vaccines, they had very little, if any, Gulf War illness or multi-symptom disease. And the French officers that were embedded in the US units didn't have those issues unless they were ordered to take the vaccines.
Really?
Then some of
We
them had
actually
issues.
we had a British officer.
So a lot of
or
that,
British
a lot of
sergeant
that's
that was-
traceable back to whether you received the multiple military vaccines or not. But also we think it's more complicated than that, but that's what started it off.
That's interesting.
Boy, that is that. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
When I got into this, when I started trying to follow up on some of these people that fell into these groups, and I got into all kinds of trouble.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you're amongst friends here.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Amongst friends, absolutely.
And I really do think you getting with Sarah would be a great idea, because that right there would open up a can of worms. I mean, throughout the world. And I mean, this show is worldwide. And I mean, I have guys from Australia, from Britain, all of them that taken, the vaccine, that has taken, been exposed to stuff. Here, I know we have more freedom, because after listening to their damn stories, I'd be pissed.
well, part of the issue with, for example, the COVID vaccines, and I know this issue quite well. I'm fully vaccinated and boosted with COVID, by the way, against COVID, because I'm a firm believer in the mRNA vaccines, but they have to be administered properly. And one of the things that they were doing initially is they weren't administering them carefully. It turns out one of the things that you have to absolutely avoid with these mRNA vaccines is injecting it into the blood. And of course, this can happen when you're getting an intramuscular injection very easily. If the needle goes into a blood vessel, you'll inject this vaccine directly into the blood, and that's a major problem, major issue. If you don't, if it doesn't get in the blood, no problem. So, but
That's interesting.
for a long time. So one of the things that they can avoid this by doing what's called aspiration immunization. So aspiration, all this is you take the essentially the vaccine loaded in a syringe with a needle, and you first try and see if you inject the needle in and pull back on the needle a little bit, if there's any blood that comes back through the needle, that'll tell you you're too close to a blood vessel. And if that's the case, pull that out and throw it away. Start doing a new one. And if you don't hit a blood vessel, I don't think there's any problem with any of the vaccines. That's the issue.
Fantastic. I like hearing that.
That's interesting, because that's not something you're ever going to hear on any news broadcast.
Right.
No, unfortunately not. But I think that may not be the only issue, but that's the major issue, because there's no reason why these mRNA vaccines aren't totally safe. But if they're injected directly into the blood, that's a problem. And that's why I think those cases, the rare
What were you
cases
saying,
that
Sarah?
get cardiomyopathy, for example, or blood coagulation effects, that's when it's injected into the blood. You avoid that, you avoid the problem.
Can I ask a question before we get in trouble, Kevin?
Huh? That answered everything right there.
Yeah, can I? So, Dr. Nicholson, did I read somewhere in the past something? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but something, the NTF factor related to COVID?
Well, yeah, I published a paper on this because of our observations that, particularly with Gulf War veterans who had this infection of the mycoplasma. So the title of the paper was, does mycoplasma infection set you up for a lethal COVID disease? So what we studied were the people that died of COVID, and the ones that they had an infection, whether it be tuberculosis or Lyme disease or mycoplasma, because mycoplasma is very prominent in Lyme disease. It's a very common co-infection with tuberculosis. So if you have these infections, you're much more likely to die of COVID if you get the SARS-CoV-2 infection. So the SARS-CoV-2 is the virus which gives you COVID-19. And if you have this dual infection, you're much more likely to be in ICU, on a respirator, and dead within, a month or two. So, and that's what we found.
And the reason I ask that is because I am not vaccinated. I'm not boosted, but during the time that the COVID was going on was during the same time that I was dosing with the NTF factor. And when I actually did return to a part-time job, if anyone is exposed to COVID, I should have been exposed to COVID. And
Well,
family members.
if you're asking me, does NT factor lipids protect you from COVID? I doubt that. But one thing it will do is it will ameliorate the disease process. It will counter some of the things that COVID does. Particularly with
lessen
COVID
the effect.
infection, there's a burst of free radicals that cause a lot of damage, and this will help circumvent that, and it'll help make the whole process milder. So the disease course will be milder if you're taking a good dose of the anti-factor lipids. So
And I buy that. I'll buy that.
By that. Sarah, do you have anything?
I just wanted to state that there's several hypotheses out there, and without the medical research, we may never know what causes vaccine injury in some individuals. But the hypothesis is, and from the research corporation that we have hired out of California to conduct our first set of vaccine injury research, is that it's due to the adjuvants placed in some vaccines and potentially a biomarker on the blood that makes some more susceptible than others. And why they believe they're seeing more vaccine injuries in the COVID vaccine is possibly potentially to this adjuvant. It's a different type of adjuvant, but it's still an adjuvant in the sense that it is a lipid-based substance that wraps around the mRNA cellular structure to give it more stability.
well, they should have used the anti-factor lipids. That's all I got to say about that.
Absolutely.
The
Absolutely.
anti-factor lipids are safe, and what they use was uncertain in terms of its safety, long-term safety issues. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Well, we know from research that high adjuvants do cause injury. The squalene adjuvant was produced to
they do, absolutely, they do.
autoimmune, to cause autoimmune in animals, and it does cause autoimmune in some humans. So without research, we may never know.
Absolutely. And I agree with you about the adjuvants that are put in vaccines. And we still don't know what adjuvant they put in. Believe me, the squalene is only part of the story with the anthrax vaccine.
Right.
sir.
I've been on that like a dog on a bone, but it's been very
There's a
difficult.
whole project that was called Project Badger, and is definitely a very hush project that no one wants to talk about.
Nobody wants to talk about Project Badger. Nobody wants it. In fact, that's like hitting a live wire. It's like
You know,
thinking
hey,
live electrical wire.
I tell you what, this has been a very, very informative,
Absolutely.
very informative. And I'm going to go around the round table, as we so say, and I'm going to ask John, do you have any questions for Dr. Nicholson?
No, I just appreciate all the information and being candid about things, and appreciate the answers, because we do this non-edited, especially on live. I mean, put it out there like it is. And although you've given some medical information that might be above a lot of our heads, when we, as Kevin and I were talking tonight, we'll say, hey, dumb it down a little bit. But you've given very clean, put things in a very clean format. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it was very crisp. Wade?
I appreciate all the research that's going on out there. I'm big into Roscamp Institute and their research. I'm big into anybody that's going to spend some money for some research, but I will follow Dr. Nicholson's advice and research to the end above all others.
Sarah?
Thanks for that.
I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Nicholson, for being so bold to bring the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And there's not a whole lot in the medical community that are as bold as you, sir. So I appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, when I first got in, final note, when I first got involved in this in 1992, 1993, I almost lost my job because of it. And I was a tenured professor. So if they could get at me and fire me, which is very hard to fire a tenured professor, they can do it to anybody. So it was like hitting a live wire. So I've been through all that. So I know, I know the problems.
But
Anything
look,
new there's an issue with, or anything that touches a sensitive chord has issues.
but,
Yes, sir.
but look how far you came.
Beg pardon?
Look how far you came.
Well, I'm a survivor.
That's right. As we all are.
Yeah.
But Dr. Nicholson, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I mean, if anybody is interested, I will help veterans get at least their first supply of the anti-factor lipids without cost if they contact me. I try and do everything I can to help them. And I'll continue to do that.
Yes, sir.
Well, we
I'm
appreciate
gonna go ahead. I want to thank each and every one of y'all coming around the table. I know we got one next week. I want to especially thank Dr. Garth Nicolson. Everything that you have talked to us about is Sarah's right. Coming on here telling us the whole truth. I mean, I feel really good. I don't know why, but I feel like I got informed this time about something. I have an answer.
Yeah,
And I do. I think a lot of veterans are going to feel that way after they hear this. And I think a lot of spouses are going to have answers too. So I just want to thank each and every one of y'all. And, you know, I want to just tell y'all have a great night. And I will see y'all next week. And for every veterans, remember, this is Veterans Connecting. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you for listening to Go For Side Effects. If you have any stories you would like to share or just have any comments or questions, please email me at kevinsimon@goforsideeffects.com. Just to let all of our listeners know, we have opened an online store. All proceeds will go to helping veterans connect. The link will be in the description below.